Do you know what it is to be tortured at the hands of a god?
Spoiler alert. Doomed to Die, the most recent episode of Amazon's The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, featured Celebrimbor, the elven smith, realizing Sauron's deceit in an attempt to persuade him to craft the 9 rings of power for men.
They shall be rings of power.
With no outside distractions, Celebrimbor finished the 9 rings for men that he had been reluctant to build in a mental prison. He was unable to recognize An-Natar for who he truly was, the Dark Lord Sauron,
A sharer of gifts. An-Natar.
until he saw that little things were constantly circling him, much like a mouse in his workshop doing the same things over and over again. Nevertheless, it is already too late. Celebrimbor's adherents have been persuaded by Sauron that he has lost his mind, and Adar and his army of orcs are encircling Eregion. Now, the 9 Rings' destiny is in jeopardy. Unwavering fans of J.R.R. Tolkien are aware that the 9 kings of men who get the rings will eventually turn into the Lord of the Rings ringwraiths, also known as Nazgul, the shadowy, masked individuals who followed Frodo around while he set out to destroy Sauron's One Ring. But once Galadriel takes ownership of the rings at the end of Episode 7, Rings of Power has left viewers with one unanswered question. How are men going to acquire them?
9 rings. To enslave the world of men.
Welcome to Movie Spy. In the Silmarillion, Tolkien provided a more comprehensive account of the 9 Rings of Power. The distribution of each ring is briefly explained to viewers in the prologue of Peter Jackson's film adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. The script took care to highlight a particular detail about every race in Middle-earth that received the rings. It is said about the elves that they are immortal, wisest, and fairest of all beings. According to the description, the dwarves are great miners and craftsmen of the mountain halls. The only people for whom this description has a bad connotation are men. The narrator, Galadriel, states that above all, they desire power. Famously, Tolkien's own prologue, composed in rhyme, included a brief account of each race's number of rings granted to them: 9 for men, 7 for dwarves, and 3 for elves. Here's a pertinent passage from that poem: 9 for mortal men doomed to die. This sentence from the poem serves as the inspiration for the title of Rings of Power, Episode 7. It was implied in Jackson's prologue that placing this much power in the hands of men was risky.
We cannot give rings to men. The risk of corruption is simply too great.
Even men who were formerly favored by elves, like the Númenóreans, who are envious of elves' eternal life. The process of creating the 19 rings was described in greater detail in Tolkien's posthumously published work than it was in The Lord of the Rings. In Of the Rings of Power in the Third Age, the final section of the Silmarillion, Tolkien detailed how the rings were forged in Erebor and how the elves learned of Sauron's scheme. Similar to his persona in Rings of Power, Sauron's initial avatar was An-Natar, Lord of Gifts. When the elves learn who he is, they move to protect the rings from him. He fights them in a fit of rage. He reclaims the 7 made for dwarves and the 9 for men during this battle. A few of these events have been rearranged by Rings of Power.
You will give me the 9.
During the 3, ruler of Khazad-dûm spirals into madness as the dwarves obtain their 9 rings before the rings meant for men are created. According to Tolkien, Sauron gave men the 9 rings. The eastern kingdoms of Middle-earth and the Númenóreans were included in this legislation. There may not be much chance for viewers to witness the 9 rings being distributed to the realms of men or the transformation of these monarchs into ringwraiths with only 1 episode remaining. J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay, the showrunners, might decide to postpone that descent until Season 3. A significant question about the 9 rings for men is raised in Rings of Power, Episode 7. The main concern highlighted in Rings of Power Season 2, Episode 7 is how Sauron plans to reclaim the 9 rings. The footage that remains for viewers shows Celebrimbor sneaking Galadriel the 9 rings before Sauron knew about it. It appears that Eregion is destined to collapse with his kingdom, which is canonically right, rather than departing from it. The destiny of Celebrimbor was expounded upon by Tolkien in Unfinished Tales of Númenor and Middle-earth. Celebrimbor was made to reveal the whereabouts of the other rings by Sauron through coercion, but he would not reveal the whereabouts of the 3 elven rings. After a while, he passed away from his wounds, and when Sauron attacked the Grey Havens, his corpse was displayed to his fellow elves. It is probable that in the Season 2 finale, Rings of Power may conclude Celebrimbor's saga. Given the proximity of Charles Edward's character to death, it would seem logical not to renew his contract for a further season, according to Tolkien's legend. Even though Edwards has played the elven craftsman with dedication and excellence, it is a somber thought. It is probably best for audiences to prepare for Celebrimbor's sad but potentially happy ending. The Elven Lord's arc in the show was quite interesting, as Sauron was able to appeal to his ego and get the rings made. Perhaps a departure from Tolkien, but no different from what Jackson accomplished to give his characters more depth in his own films. After the 9 rings fall into the hands of men, there is still much to be covered. It is feasible that Celebrimbor will reveal Galadriel's whereabouts in his last moments, putting her in direct confrontation with Sauron again if the program writers adhere to Tolkien's pattern. Though Celebrimbor makes bad decisions, the writers appear really interested in making the audience feel sorry for him and his character, so maybe his story may end differently. In any case, there's a good chance that Sauron will possess the 9 rings by the conclusion of Episode 8. It is possible that viewers will soon see a ring in Pharazôn's hand as terror grows in Númenor as a result of him using the Seeing Stone. Superfans will know that Pharazôn eventually joins the Witch King of Angmar's Lieutenant Corps and becomes one of the 9 Nazgûl. There are moments when rewriting Tolkien for dramatic effect is necessary in Rings of Power. For better or worse, a lot of Tolkien's writing has been adapted for the screen for various reasons, as aficionados of his universe have observed. Jackson justified many of his alterations in detail on the behind-the-scenes DVDs of the Lord of the Rings box set releases upon completion of his movies in the early 2000s. One could argue that the Hobbit movies, which were released years later, were less legitimate and made much more liberties with the original material. Unfortunately, a lot of the Hobbit trilogy's unevenness may be traced back to production issues and a tight schedule, allowing it a little more wiggle room with viewers. Regardless of the extent to which Jackson changed Tolkien's writing, a sizable segment of the fan base still seemed to appreciate him above McKay and Payne. No matter how well-liked Tolkien's works were by those who read them, it must be admitted that his books were unfit for film for a long time. In the same behind-the-scenes interviews shown on his DVDs, Jackson acknowledged that he was embarking on an enormous undertaking. Furthermore, Payne and McKay have to create a lot of the tale framework themselves because Tolkien never finished a lot of the material they are working with. Taking on Tolkien is no easy task, much less creating characters and storylines from what may be merely regarded as encyclopedic works. Christopher, Tolkien's son, was well known for thinking that Jackson's adaptations degraded his father's writings to corny action flicks. However, in the more than 2 decades since their publication, they have managed to become well-loved classics. Maybe when the dust settles and people see that Rings of Power is what it really is, an unbeatable cinematic endeavor, the same thing will happen to it. Thanks for watching.